The air in the private conference room on the 42nd floor of the One North Wacker building tasted like stale espresso and high-altitude air conditioning. It was exactly 2:14 a.m. If you looked down through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Chicago River looked like a jagged line of liquid obsidian, cutting through a forest of glowing concrete. But inside, the only light came from a single, low-hanging halogen lamp. It focused a harsh white circle onto a polished mahogany table, illuminating three things: a stack of crisp, cream-colored document pages exactly 4 inches high, a heavy matte black Mont Blanc fountain pen, and a thumb. It was a thick, manicured thumb, pressing down with enough force to turn the nail completely white. "If you press any harder, Garrick, you're going to bleed through the bond paper," a voice said from the shadows. Garrick didn't look up. His silver hair, usually immaculately coiffed for the cameras of the local business news, was slightly disheveled. He adjusted the cuff of his bespoke Brioni suit jacket, his jaw shifting as he ground his teeth. "Shut up, Brooks," Garrick muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He slid the pen across the bottom of page 84. The scratch of the iridium nib against the heavy paper sounded like a small animal clawing at a door. "We don't have a choice. If the probate court freezes the secondary accounts before the liquid assets clear, the whole northern development collapses by Monday morning. I need that signature on the record tonight." Sitting 2 chairs down, his son, Brooks, was rhythmically tapping a polished leather loafer against the base of the table. Tap, tap, tap. Brooks was 28, possessed the kind of tan that only comes from ignoring a family real estate empire to spend Tuesdays on a yacht in Lake Michigan, and currently had a small, nervous bead of sweat tracking down his temple. "I still don't get how the nerd managed to tie up the shell accounts," Brooks whispered, leaning into the light. His eyes were wide, bloodshot. "He was a bean counter, Dad, a corporate nobody who spent his weekends organizing his sock drawer by thread count. He was supposed to be gone. The hospital said exactly what we needed to hear to get us into this room," Garrick snapped. He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing through the empty, cavernous office suite like a pistol shot. He looked across the table at his wife, Beatrice, who was fastidiously ignoring the tension by adjusting her pearl necklace in the reflection of the dark window. "Tessa said it was handled. She said Caleb left everything in a single, unencumbered vehicle. We sign the entry disclosures, we take the administrative control, we bury the body, and we survive. That is the order of operations." Garrick stood up, smoothing his tie. He held the folder against his chest like a shield. "But if either of you breathes a word to the auditors before the wire transfers hit the Swiss accounts, I won't just cut you out of the business, Brooks. I will personally hand the state's attorney the ledger from the Loop development." Brooks stopped tapping his foot. His face went pale. Inside the walls of that dark office, the silence returned, thick and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that precedes a controlled demolition. You see the flashes at the base of the building, you see the concrete begin to shudder, and you're just waiting for the sound to hit you. Before we find out exactly what was hidden inside that 4-inch stack of paper and why a multi-millionaire developer was signing legal documents in the dead of night, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is a story about the danger of assuming someone is too weak to strike back, and you won't want to miss how the pieces fall into place. To understand how Garrick found himself signing away his life in a dark boardroom, you have to understand the invisible man who built the room itself. Caleb did not look like a man who could dismantle a real estate empire. At 34, he possessed the quiet, unassuming posture of someone who spent his life looking at things other people deliberately tried to hide. As a senior forensic accountant for a boutique regulatory firm, Caleb's entire profession consisted of translating human greed into Arabic numerals. He could look at a balance sheet and tell you if a CEO was having an affair, if a vice president was skimming from the pension fund, or if a company was 6 weeks away from insolvency. He was precise, he was thorough, and to the family he married into, he was utterly invisible. Caleb had met Tessa 6 years earlier at a charity gala where he was auditing the foundation's books, and she was attempting to escape her mother's suffocating social calendar. Tessa was different from the rest of the family. She possessed a sharp, independent streak and a genuine talent for landscape architecture that her father constantly dismissed as fancy gardening. They fell in love over late-night diners and shared cynical observations about the Chicago elite. But when Caleb entered the family orbit, he realized very quickly that he hadn't just married Tessa. He had married a corporate hierarchy. To Garrick, people were divided into two categories: assets and liabilities. Assets were politicians who could be bought, land that could be zone flipped, and banks that could be leveraged. Liabilities were anything that cost money without offering a return. And from the moment Caleb refused to use his accounting credentials to help Garrick obscure a suspicious line item on a tax return for the commercial high-rise project in River North, Caleb became the ultimate liability. The family gatherings at the sprawling estate in Lake Forest were a masterclass in polite cruelty. "Caleb, darling," Beatrice would say during Thanksgiving dinner, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness reserved for bad champagne. "It must be so fascinating to work with. Numbers all day. So safe. No real risk of losing anything important, I suppose. Not like Garrick. Garrick operates on a global scale. If he makes a mistake, hundreds of people lose their jobs. If you make a mistake, what happens? A decimal point moves." Brooks would usually chuckle into his crystal tumbler of 20-year-old scotch. "Hey, leave the guy alone, Mom. Someone has to make sure the IRS doesn't look too closely at the small stuff. Every king needs a scribe." Caleb would just smile, take a sip of his water, and keep his eyes on his plate. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't tell them that the small stuff Brooks was laughing about was actually a trail of breadcrumbs that suggested Garrick's flagship development company was operating on a massive, highly illegal structure of rolling debt. He stayed quiet because he loved Tessa. And for 5 years, that love was enough to act as insulation against the frostbite of her family's arrogance. Then came the second Tuesday of April. It was a typical, damp Chicago spring afternoon. Caleb was working at his desk in their apartment, his screen filled with a complex maze of interconnected corporate entities linked to a shell company called Vanguard North LLC. It was an entity he had stumbled across while reviewing public land acquisition records, an entity that kept popping up in relation to Garrick's projects. Suddenly, a strange, localized heat flared behind his sternum. It wasn't the dull ache of indigestion. It felt as if someone had poured liquid lead directly into his chest cavity. Caleb tried to stand, but his knees simply refused the command. The room tilted violently to the left, the glowing columns of his spreadsheet spinning into a blur of green and white. His phone was on the kitchen island, barely 6 feet away, but that 6 feet felt like the expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. He dragged himself across the hardwood floor, every breath feeling like he was inhaling broken glass, until his fingers closed around the cold glass of the device. He didn't call Garrick, he didn't call Brooks. He dialed 911, managed to gasp out his address to the operator, and then the world went completely gray. When Caleb opened his eyes again, the smell of old wood was gone, replaced by the sharp, sterile tang of isopropyl alcohol and synthetic linen. A heart monitor was beeping with a steady, rhythmic cadence near his left ear. He was in the intensive care unit at Northwestern Memorial. Tessa was sitting in a vinyl chair beside the bed, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with red. The moment she saw him move, she reached out, her hand trembling as she took his. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. The doctors said it was an acute myocarditis event, a sudden, severe inflammation of the heart muscle brought on by a latent viral infection and extreme stress. They had to stabilize your rhythm. "Caleb, you were gone for nearly 2 minutes." Caleb tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was coated in sand. He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the bedside table where Tessa's phone sat. The screen was constantly lighting up with text notifications. "Your family?" Caleb managed to croak out, assuming they were checking on her, or perhaps in some small way, checking on him. Tessa's face didn't soften. Instead, a peculiar, hard expression settled over her features. She looked away, her fingers tightening around his with a grip that was almost painful. "They know you're in the hospital," she said shortly. "Are they coming?" Tessa didn't answer. She reached over, picked up her phone, and unlocked it. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned the screen toward Caleb's face. It was a text chain from her father, Garrick. The timestamp was from less than an hour ago, right when Caleb was being moved out of the emergency surgery suite. "Garrick, your mother and I have the charity board dinner at 8, and Brooks is in the middle of closing the land deal. We'll come if he actually dies. Otherwise, keep us posted. Don't waste the mileage if it's just a scare." Caleb stared at the glowing blue bubbles on the screen. The heart monitor beside him didn't skip a beat. It remained steady, a cold mechanical pulse in the quiet room. In that exact moment, something fundamental broke inside Caleb. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was the complete, instantaneous crystallization of a strategy. He looked at the text, then looked up at his wife. He saw the profound shame in her eyes, the realization that her own flesh and blood regarded her husband's survival as a logistical inconvenience. "Tessa," Caleb said, his voice stronger now, the sand in his throat replaced by something sharp and cold. "Do you trust me?" "With my life," she said without hesitation. "Good," Caleb whispered, leaning back into the pillows as a faint smile touched the corners of his lips. "Because as far as your father is concerned, I think it's time we give him exactly what he asked for." Caleb was totally unaware that the plan he was setting into motion that afternoon would not just expose his in-laws, it would force him to risk every single dollar, every piece of property, and every legal safety net he had spent his entire career building, with absolutely no guarantee that he would walk away from the wreckage with his freedom intact. The transformation began 48 hours later, long before Caleb was even discharged from the hospital. While Garrick and Brooks were busy attending high-profile luncheons and finalizing zoning permits for their new multi-million-dollar residential development, Caleb was running a silent parallel operation from his hospital bed using an encrypted tablet. His first call wasn't to a doctor or a specialist. It was to Nadia, a senior special agent with the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division. Nadia was a sharp, no-nonsense woman of 45 who had spent 2 decades putting white-collar criminals in federal penitentiaries. Caleb had worked as an expert witness for her team on 3 different high-stakes corporate embezzlement cases over the last decade. They shared a mutual appreciation for ironclad evidence and an utter disdain for people who thought a balance sheet was a work of fiction. "Caleb," Nadia's voice had cracked over the encrypted line when she answered, "I heard you had a scare. What are you doing on a secure line from an ICU bed?" "Nadia, I need you to look at an entity," Caleb said, ignoring the question entirely. His voice was steady, driven by an icy focus. "It's registered in Delaware, but its primary banking footprint is right here in Cook County. Vanguard North LLC. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by the rapid, rhythmic clacking of a mechanical keyboard. "Vanguard North," Nadia muttered. "Yeah, it's a proprietary holding company. It's got its fingers in 3 different commercial developments along the river." "Why?" "Because Vanguard North isn't a holding company," Caleb said, his eyes tracking the saline drip above his bed. "It's a debt sink. Garrick is using it to absorb the uncollateralized liabilities from his main construction business. He's taking out massive short-term commercial loans through Vanguard to pay off the contractors on his primary projects, making the main company look incredibly profitable and clean to his primary lenders. But Vanguard is toxic. It's sitting on nearly $47 million of high-interest short-term debt that's due to mature in exactly 30 days. That's a classic shell game," Nadia said, her tone suddenly sharpening, the investigator in her waking up. "But to prove criminal fraud, we need the internal ledgers. We need the physical signatures showing he knowingly used fraudulent assets to secure those loans. Right now, on paper, Vanguard looks like an independent entity that just happens to do business with him. We can't touch it without a federal subpoena, and a judge won't grant one based on public land records." "You won't need a subpoena," Caleb said quietly. "I'm going to bring the ledgers to you, along with the man who signed them." To execute the next phase, Caleb needed an expert in digital architecture. Enter Xavier, a 24-year-old software engineer who lived 2 doors down from Caleb and Tessa's apartment. Xavier was a brilliant, eccentric kid who wore oversized hoodies, lived on a diet of cold brew coffee, and had spent his teenage years finding security flaws in major banking applications just to see if he could. Caleb had helped Xavier set up his first corporate tax structure for his software consulting business 3 years ago, saving him thousands of dollars in legal fees. Xavier considered Caleb a statistical wizard. Within 6 hours of Caleb's call, Xavier had set up a secure, closed-circuit network that mirrored the internal servers of Garrick's real estate firm. "Here's the thing, Caleb," Xavier explained via a video link, his face illuminated by 3 different monitors in his dark apartment. "Garrick's security is old school. He trusts biometric firewalls at his main office, but his remote access portals, the ones his son Brooks uses to upload project expenses from his tablet while he's sitting on his boat, are incredibly leaky. Brooks uses the same password for his corporate cloud access that he uses for his online poker account. It took me 4 minutes to map their entire rolling debt structure." Xavier paused, chewing on the inside of his lip. "But Caleb, If you do this, you're using your own capital to buy into the secondary debt tranches of Vanguard North to get legal access to those files. You're leveraging your own savings, your apartment, everything. If Garrick realizes what you're doing and defaults before you get the signatures, you and Tessa lose every dime you've ever made. You'll be entirely wiped out. Caleb looked toward the hospital window. Outside, a light rain was beginning to fall, streaking the glass. He won't default, Xavier, because he thinks he's about to inherit the capital to clear it all. The next morning, the rumor began to circulate. It didn't start with a press release. It started with a series of quiet, deliberate phone calls made by Tessa to a few select family friends, the kind of people who couldn't hold on to a secret if their lives depended on it. She spoke in a low, trembling voice, mentioning that Caleb's condition had taken a sudden, tragic turn for the worse. She spoke about a hidden private investment trust Caleb had quietly managed for years, a trust that held a significant liquid position in a major logistics tech startup that had recently gone public. "I don't know what to do," Tessa told her aunt over the phone, knowing the woman would call Beatrice within 5 minutes. The lawyers say Caleb's personal estate is worth over $12 million in liquid stock, but because of how he structured his private trust, it can only be released to the family if there's a unanimous administrative sign-off from all immediate relatives within 48 hours of his passing. Otherwise, the whole thing automatically routes to an international medical research foundation. The bait was laid, and it was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. Caleb knew exactly how Garrick's mind worked. To Garrick, $12 million of unencumbered liquid capital wasn't just a fortune, it was a life raft. It was exactly the amount he needed to inject into Vanguard North to prevent the $47 million debt bomb from exploding and destroying his entire legacy. On Friday afternoon, the final piece of the trap fell into place. Garrick was sitting in his expansive corner office, staring at a printout of his company's cash flow projections for the coming month, when Brooks burst through the door without knocking. His face was flushed with excitement. "Dad! Did you hear?" Brooks gasped, slamming his hands onto the desk. "Tessa's husband, Caleb, he's gone. Complications from the heart surgery. He passed away 2 hours ago at Northwestern." Garrick didn't flinch. He didn't offer a word of sympathy for his daughter. Instead, his eyes narrowed as he slowly stood up. "And the trust? The liquid shares Tessa's aunt was talking about?" "It's real," Brooks said, his voice a hurried whisper. "I called a contact at the probate office. Caleb had a private, blind trust registered under an administrative wrapper. $12.5 million, completely liquid. But here's the catch. His attorney just reached out to Tessa. Because of the specific terms, the entire family, you, Mom, me, and Tessa, have to physically sign the execution and acceptance disclosures before the probate court closes at midnight tonight. If we don't sign, the funds vanish into some global charity. Tessa is an absolute wreck. She can barely speak. She told the attorney to just set up a midnight meeting at the downtown boardroom so we can get it over with." Garrick let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had been visible in his shoulders for weeks seemed to evaporate. A cold, predatory satisfaction settled into his eyes. "The idiot," Garrick murmured, a slow, dark smile spreading across his face. "He spent his whole life counting my money, and in the end, he provides the exact capital I need to save my empire. Get your mother. Tell her to cancel her dinner plans. We are going downtown tonight." Garrick was completely unaware that by ordering his family into that car, he wasn't marching toward a multi-million-dollar inheritance. He was walking directly into a meticulously prepared legal slaughterhouse, where his own signature would become the very weapon used to destroy him. Which brings us back to the Midnight Ink. By 2:30 a.m., the atmosphere inside the 42nd floor boardroom had completely shifted from quiet greed to a strange, heavy tension. Garrick had finished signing the massive stack of document pages. He slid the heavy folder across the polished mahogany table toward the dark end of the room, where Alana, the estate attorney Caleb had hired, sat in silence. Alana was a statuesque woman with a sharp, angular bob and eyes that looked like they had never blinked in their entire professional existence. She picked up the folder, carefully checked the signature on every single page, and then placed it neatly inside a leather briefcase. "Excellent," Garrick said, leaning back in his chair and checking his gold Rolex. "Now that the administrative disclosures are signed and executed, I want the wire transfer initiated immediately. Our corporate accounts at Chase need to see the credit pending by 6 a.m. Alana didn't move to open her laptop. She didn't pick up her phone. She simply looked at Garrick with an expression of calm, professional detachment. "The transfer will not be going to Chase, Mr. Vance," Alana said smoothly. Garrick's brow furrowed. What do you mean it's not going to Chase? I just signed the acceptance paperwork. As the head of the family estate, I have the legal authority to direct the distribution of the liquid assets. You did sign the paperwork, Garrick, a new voice said. The voice didn't come from Alana. It came from the heavy oak double doors at the back of the boardroom. The doors swung open, the bright fluorescent lights of the hallway flooding into the dark room. Standing in the doorway, perfectly dressed in a charcoal gray suit, with a healthy color in his cheeks and a calm, relaxed posture, was Caleb. Beside him stood Tessa, her face entirely free of tears, her arm linked tightly through her husband's. And flanking them were 4 individuals in dark blue windbreakers with gold lettering across the back, IRS-CI. At the front of the group was Nadia, a leather folder under her arm, her badge glowing under the bright hallway lights. Beatrice let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "Caleb, you're supposed to be dead?" Caleb walked into the room, his footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. He took a seat at the opposite end of the long table, looking directly at his father-in-law. "I told Tessa to tell you that my condition took a turn for the worse. And technically, it did. My view of this family became entirely terminal." Garrick slammed both hands on the table. Standing up so quickly, his chair rolled back and hit the glass window with a loud thud. "What is the meaning of this scam? Tessa, what have you done? This is fraud. You lied about his death to force us into a legal negotiation." "Actually, Garrick, no one lied about anything," Caleb said, leaning forward and resting his hands on the table. "Tessa told her aunt that I had passed away from my recovery complications. What she didn't mention was that the recovery she was talking about was the recovery of your internal corporate ledgers. And the complications are the federal charges you're currently looking at." Brooks stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You think you're clever, you pathetic little clerk, so you faked a medical relapse to get us into a room. So what? We haven't done anything wrong. We signed a standard inheritance acceptance form for your private trust. If there is no trust, the documents are completely null and void. We'll just walk out of here right now." Brooks moved toward the door, but one of the IRS agents quietly stepped into his path, his hand resting calmly near his belt. Brooks stopped dead in his tracks. "I wouldn't do that, Mr. Vance," Nadia said, walking over to the table and opening her leather folder. She pulled out a fresh document and slid it across the mahogany toward Garrick. "You see, you didn't sign an inheritance acceptance form tonight. Caleb's private trust doesn't hold stock in a tech startup. It holds something far more interesting." Garrick's eyes darted down to the document in front of him. His face went from flushed red to a dull ash gray within 3 seconds. "Over the last 2 weeks," Caleb explained, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, like a teacher reading a grocery list, "I use my personal capital, leveraged against every asset Tessa and I own, to quietly buy up the secondary commercial debt tranches of Vanguard North LLC, the shell company you've been using to hide your $47 million of uncollateralized liabilities. By 4 p.m. yesterday afternoon, my private trust became the majority debt holder of your entire corporate structure." Caleb pointed to the 4-inch stack of paper inside Alana's briefcase. "The documents you just spent the last 2 hours signing weren't probate disclosures. Page 1 through 40 were formal corporate debt consolidation agreements. By signing them, you didn't accept an inheritance. You explicitly acknowledged that Vanguard North LLC is a wholly owned subsidiary of your primary real estate firm. You legally brought those $47 million of hidden liabilities onto your main balance sheet." The room went completely silent. The only sound was the faint, mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system. "Why would you do that?" Brooks stammered, his voice cracking, looking wildly between his father and Caleb. "That doesn't make sense. If you own the debt, you just forced us to merge it. That doesn't prove we did anything illegal. It just means we owe your trust the money." "It means a lot more than that, Brooks," Caleb said softly. He looked up at Nadia. Nadia stepped into the light, placing her hands on the back of a chair. "Mr. Garrick Vance, by signing page 84 of that folder, you formally declared under penalty of perjury that the financial disclosures inside that packet, which match the internal ledgers Caleb recovered from your cloud servers, are the true, accurate records of your firm's operations for the last 5 years. The problem is, those records directly contradict the tax returns and loan applications you submitted to the federal government to secure your construction grants for the Riverfront project." Nadia reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of federal arrest warrants. You didn't just confess to a civil debt corporate restructuring, Garrick. You just verified, with your own signature, the exact evidence we needed to execute a federal indictment for corporate tax evasion, bank fraud, and wire fraud. Garrick collapsed back into his chair. The fierce, untouchable titan of the Chicago real estate market looked suddenly small, his expensive suit looking a size too big for his sagging shoulders. He stared at the matte black Mont Blanc pen still sitting on the table, realizing that the ink he had so eagerly pressed into the paper was the fluid that had just sealed his fate. "Tessa," Beatrice pleaded, her voice trembling as she looked at her daughter. "You can't let them do this. We are your family, your father's company. Everything we built, it will be destroyed. Think of our reputation." Tessa looked at her mother, her expression entirely neutral. There was no anger in her eyes, no desire for theatrical revenge. There was only a profound, immovable distance. "When Caleb was lying in that hospital bed, fighting to keep his heart beating, you told me not to waste the mileage unless he actually died," Tessa said, her voice quiet but carrying perfectly through the large room. "You didn't care about his life? You only cared about the inconvenience of his survival. Well, Mother, the Caleb you thought you could treat like an invisible servant is gone. He died to this family the moment you sent that text. You came here tonight for an asset distribution. Consider this your final payout." Nadia stepped forward, gesturing to the agents behind her. "Garrick Vance, Brooks Vance, please stand up and place your hands behind your back." As the agents moved forward, the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the boardroom, a sound that was completely clean, perfectly precise, and entirely permanent. An hour later, the 42nd floor was empty again. The harsh halogen lamp had been turned off, leaving the boardroom in the soft, ambient glow of the Chicago skyline. The mahogany table was completely bare, save for the faint, circular indentation where the heavy stack of documents had sat for hours. Caleb and Tessa stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching two black federal SUVs pull away from the curb 42 stories below, their flashing lights reflecting faintly off the dark surface of the river before they disappeared into the urban canyons of the Loop. "Are you okay?" Caleb asked, turning his head slightly to look at his wife. Tessa let out a long breath, her head resting gently against his shoulder. For the first time in 6 years, the tension that always seemed to tighten her jaw whenever her family's name was mentioned was completely gone. "I've never felt lighter," she whispered. "Where do we go from here?" Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened an app showing a clean, simple interface. The short-term debt tranches he had purchased had already been processed through the federal whistleblower program. Because his audit had directly led to the recovery of tens of millions of dollars in evaded federal taxes, the standard statutory whistleblower bounty, 20% of the recovered assets, had already been approved for provisional transfer into their clean, independent accounts. It was more than enough to fund Tessa's dream of building an independent, sustainable landscape architecture firm, completely free from the shadow of her father's influence. And it was more than enough for Caleb to never have to look at another fraudulent balance sheet for the rest of his life, unless he absolutely wanted to. "Well," Caleb said, a faint, genuine smile warming his face as he locked the phone and slid it back into his pocket. "The movers are arriving at our apartment at 8 a.m. The tickets to Auckland are confirmed for Tuesday afternoon. I think it's time we finally go take a look at that land in New Zealand." He turned, taking her hand as they walked toward the double doors, leaving the dark boardroom behind them. "After all," Caleb murmured as the doors clicked shut, plunging the room into total darkness, "we shouldn't waste the mileage.